Hi everyone, welcome to the first night of Spooky Week. My name is Ariana and I'm the Director of Spirit and Traditions for the crew. We have a very exciting evening planned for you. Tonight, podcaster Esther Ludlow, also known as Once Upon a Crime Podcast on Instagram, will present a case that occurred in the Wilmington area. Everyone, please welcome Esther.
Hi, how are you doing?
Hi Esther, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us all tonight. Tonight you'll be covering the case of Anne Marie Fahey, which is a bit unusual as the case was solved without a body. Please take it away, Esther.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. So today we're going to be doing a murder case out of Wilmington, Delaware. And let me tell you a little bit about the podcast and what I do. So you're going to be getting kind of a feel for what Once Upon a Crime podcast is like. So basically, it's a weekly podcast, true crime podcast. I take a different case every week to cover from beginning to end. And I have a background in correctional psychology, so basically psychology of crime, criminals. And so I do a little bit of going into the backgrounds and maybe some motivations of the crime, some of maybe the bio of the criminals to get an overall view of how did this crime occur, who is it that was involved, and maybe just understanding it a little bit more from that perspective. But I really do it in a storytelling style, so it's not like a clinical dry type of case that I'm doing. I'm really telling a story. So they just happen to be about crime and they're true. So with that, what I'm going to be talking to you about tonight is about the Anne Marie Fahey case, which you may have heard about. It's a little bit older. I don't know. It depends on your age, how familiar you might be with it, but it's a little bit of an older case. Happened in 1996. She was a missing persons case. And the reason I covered this one is every month in the podcast, I pick a different topic and I find cases that fit within that topic. So one of the things as I was researching another case that I found really interesting was, is it possible to prove that there was a murder and then also be able to convict the killer when there is no body? So there's a person that goes missing or a person that's suspected to have been murdered, but like we know, a lot of times when there's a murder, people will try to conceal the body. And what if it's not found? So how does that work? So that's why I looked for a few cases that had just this kind of scenario. And I found one from your area, just luckily, because I was invited to speak to University of Delaware students. So I thought, well, this is perfect. So you guys will know a little bit about this case, but maybe not know all the ins and outs of it. So let me go through that so you guys can understand. And hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for questions if you have any. So this is, like I said, we're talking about a no-body murder case. It is the case of Anne Marie Fahey. And first of all, I'm gonna let you know who she was, because there's some things that are important to know when you're looking at how a crime occurs. Is there's some things to know about who the person was, and how did they get into this situation, or how did this unfold? How did they become maybe the victim of this type of case? So Anne Marie Fahey, and we'll just grab my notes here. You guys can just go ahead and not have to look at me if you don't want to, but but let me go ahead and give you some of the notes here. So Anne Marie Fahey was born in Wilmington, Delaware in 1966. I'll give you a little bit of her bio. She was one of 6 children, and she had 4 older brothers and 1 older sister. She was the baby of the family. So she is a large Irish Catholic family, like I said, from Wilmington. She grew up in that area, all her life, and she was pretty much in a middle class home, very close knit family, church going family, just a normal, typical family in the 1960s. But when she was 9 years old, her mother died of cancer, and it was a very quick and very tragic. Because Anne Marie was the youngest, most of her siblings were already in their teens or even in their they were even young adults. She was the only one who was still pretty, like I said, she was only 9 years old. So she loses her mother. Her oldest brother at the time was 20, and all the rest were teenagers. Well, after her mom died, her dad kind of spiraled really quickly. Apparently, he had always been a bit of a drinker, but after losing his wife and also the stress of going through having 6 children and being alone, he couldn't really handle it, and his drinking really got out of control. And at this time, he just kind of went downhill from there. And there were some really unfortunate things because of this whole death in the family set up this whole situation where he ended up, he had been employed as an insurance agent, had done very well, was supporting his family. But then what happened is he ended up not being able to even hold on to a job. So like I said, it really spiraled quickly. It ended up being where they couldn't even pay the bills. The lights would get shut off. The phone would get shut off. At one time, there wasn't even hot water in the house for, months at a time, because he just didn't, he wasn't able to handle things and would just stay home and just drinking. And the kids, like I said, the older teens basically took care of Anne-Marie. So she was dependent on them quite a bit, which always made her feel like a burden. And that's going to play out later on in her life as well. But as well as that is there was only 2 that were really at home. Her youngest, the next youngest to her was her brother, Brian. They were home. He was in high school. She was, like I said, grade school, middle school. And she was pretty dependent on her brother because her dad really wasn't taking care of her. So really all the family, all the Fahey children pitched in. And go to the next slide here. So this is the Fahey family. There's Anne-Marie in a high school photo, and these are her siblings. So you can see her down here in the bottom, she's the baby. So you can see how much older all of her siblings were. While she was home, and because she was the one who was mostly home all the time with her father, having to deal with that, he became angrier and more abusive because, depression and just feeling overwhelmed and being angry about his wife's death and everything that was put upon him at that point. So he really just kind of neglected her, number one, and then later on became abusive verbally. And he would just call her terrible names. He would call her fat. He would call her ugly. As she got into high school, he would call her a slut, which it was so out of character for him. He was not that kind of person before this. And also, it was very strange because Anne-Marie was none of those things. Anne-Marie was, if anything, too serious and too mature for her age. Naturally, if you think about the situation that she was put in, she was a straight A student. She was athletic. She was a very committed Catholic, like the rest of her family. Just a good kid, and just a decent person. And worked really, really hard in school. And like I said, there was times like when she got into high school, she would have to go into school early to take a shower because there was no hot water at home, things like that. By the time she was in high school, the family was virtually homeless because her father, he defaulted on the mortgage of their house. So now there was nowhere really for her to go. And for a while, they had a very close knit neighborhood, and all the neighbors knew what had happened when they lost their mom and what was going on, and their dad was kind of spiraling. And so they all pitched in to help. But again, this made Anne-Marie feel very dependent on people, and also she felt like a burden. So then a neighbor actually took her in for about a year when she was in high school. And there was 2 things that came out of this that are interesting to note. One is that because she was living in somebody else's home, not her family's home, she was super careful to be really, really, really neat and very clean because, again, she didn't want to be a burden to anybody. So at this point, she became, it was almost like an OCD thing that came where she had to have everything, perfectly clean and neat and in place because she never wanted to be, an extra work for this family. The other thing is that she also felt guilty about eating this other family's food. So she started to eat very little, and she would just say, I'm not hungry, or I already ate, or, those kind of things, so that people weren't noticing that she was barely eating anything. And Anne Marie later on would become, she would develop an eating disorder. And this is kind of where the roots of that began. Of course, we know there's more to eating disorders than something like that. It has to do with, all of the trauma and stress and things that she was trying to cope with. So that was the other part of it. But that plays into the later story as well. So eventually she would end up moving back when she was in high school for the last year or so with her father. She would get a job just like all of her siblings did. Some of them got to leave. They, left to go to school on a scholarship, and so got out of the house and got away. She was there much longer, but finally was able to graduate high school. And in 1984, she enrolled in Wesley College in Dover. So she was there for about a year and a half, and then she transferred to the University of Delaware. In the same year that she transferred to the university, though, her father died of a heart attack. So now she has another loss. So it's loss upon loss here. You'll see, her mother died. She loses her home. The family kind of breaks up and goes their own way, although they still did whatever they could to help their youngest sister. But she became very depressed at this time, and she dropped out of college. She made a very wise decision at this point to start therapy. And she also started living, two of her brothers, the two oldest brothers actually ended up buying a house together. And you can see how close this family was. And they asked her to come move in with them, and they take care of her, get her back on her feet. So that's what happened. Then when she was kind of, doing a little better, she re-enrolled in Wesley College. She decided that the smaller campus was probably better for her. This is a girl who needed a lot of nurturing. And she just felt very lost on a bigger campus. And I think it was just, being closer to what she knew, what she was used to. So that's what she did. But she worked really hard, did really well in college. She graduated in 1992 with a degree in political science. I'm not even sure if she was very, I would imagine she was probably very active in, school government and things like that, and just got interested in that. But this is going to take her on her path to what she ends up doing for a career, which is really interesting. So I think we can go to the next slide here. Okay, so yeah, so this is when she's in school. And let's see, let's make sure I do things in order here so I don't lose you guys. So the thing that's funny is that as a podcaster, I'm used to doing everything through audio. So when I have to switch to slides or video, it's a little bit different for me. So bear with me a second. So she moved. This is her in college. Like I said, very close to her family. One of the things that she's going to do later on is go back to try to find her roots. She had a grandmother who she was very close to, who lived in Media, Pennsylvania. She lived too far away, and she worked. So she would come once a week and help take care of the children and cook and clean and those kinds of things. But that was her nan, and that's who she was. Grew up kind of like her second mother. Nan would die when she was in college, but she would later go to Ireland. She'd go on a trip with her brother to go find the place where her grandmother grew up. And this is one of the pictures that was taken there. So let's move on to her career. And one second. Okay. I think this is the next slide here. Oops. Okay, so this is why I need to get to my notes here. Hold on a second. Okay, so when she graduated from college, she ended up getting a job. She ended up getting an internship in Washington, D.C. Now, Anne Marie, one of her other things besides political sciences, she took a lot of classes, and she was fluent in Spanish. So she was actually hired as an interpreter in Washington, D.C. for, I'm not sure who exactly or which department. But so then when she came home, she was hired as a receptionist by it would be then, who was he at the time? I'm trying to remember. I want to call him senator because he's one of your senators now. Is Tom Carper. So he was a congressman at the time there in he was a Delaware congressman at the time, and she was hired as his receptionist. So then she worked on his campaign because he ran for governor in 1992, and she worked on his campaign, and he was elected in 92. So then he hired her as his scheduling secretary. So she goes from, being an intern within a couple of years, she is now the scheduling secretary for the governor, which is, pretty amazing and very exciting. So she is this young woman, had this very hard, difficult background, and now she's really kind of made it. She's really just, in her element here, having, she has a lot of friends. She's back in her home state. She's having a a social life and a great career and all of those things, and doing pretty well. Money, not so much in government. It's she still had to live on a budget, but she was okay with that because she's this young single woman and everything's going great. This picture here in the middle that you see is as Governor Carpenter with Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton would be familiar with Anne Marie because whenever his anybody in his office would call Governor Carper for meetings or things, that she would be the one that would schedule phone calls, the meetings, all of these things. So he did meet her a couple of times. Wasn't like there's kind of these rooms like, oh, she knew Bill Clinton so well. She didn't. I mean, she knew him in a professional capacity a few times. Met him in person, that kind of thing. So she works for him. Now this is going to bring her on a collision course with a man named, get him here. Oops, sorry, no one. Thomas Capano. Now this is where our story takes off. So, and I'll tell you a little bit about let me tell you a little bit about Thomas Capano, and then I'll tell you how they met. So Thomas Capano was born in October of 1949. And when he met Anne Marie, he was, I believe, 47 years old. She was like 4 years old, I believe. And he grew up in, trying to remember the names of all your towns, you guys. Let's see. Okay, so he grew up also in the Wilmington area. He was one of 5 children. He had an older sister and 3 brothers. He was the oldest son. His sister was the oldest girl, the oldest child, but we'll talk about a little bit why that's significant in a little bit. But his father was a self-made man. His father came from Calabria, Italy with his parents, and when I believe in the 1940s, he started a construction business, and he was, he basically just made himself from the ground up. He ended up becoming a very successful, a construction business. Then as his sons he had 4 sons. He figured they're all going to go into the business with him. And that's pretty much what happened, except for Tom, the oldest. He was not really one to want to work in the construction business. He kind of wasn't really expected to either. He was expected to kind of be he was the smart one. He was going to go to college. Although their father, Lou, his name was Lou, he wanted them all to go to college, but only Tom really finished. But Tom decided early on that he was going to be an attorney. So he went to college. He ended up going to Boston College. And that's where he met his wife. Her name was Kay. She graduated and became a registered nurse and started working right away. They didn't start their family for about 4 or 5 years. In the meantime, he went to law school. Now, the thing is, by this time, Lou Capano was a pretty wealthy man at this point. And he had actually constructed, there's a lot of developments. In that area, if you know Wilmington and also, and even outside of Wilmington, because they've since expanded, but they own quite a few. They own or developed or built office buildings, malls, luxury apartment buildings, lots of things, office buildings. So they were pretty, well off at this point. Well, Tom was, of course, he benefited from all of that. So he really didn't have to worry about getting a job. He could go to law school. And even though he got married while he was still in college, his parents basically paid for their, apartment and, all of those things so that he could continue to go to school and finish his legal degree. So, so things were going pretty well for old Tom there. And the brothers, two of his brothers were Lou Jr. and Joey, and they worked alongside the father, and they really helped to build the business. And so Tom, like I said, benefited from that as well. He would later become like a partial owner with his other brothers. So it was, basically this was a pretty good life. Like I said, he married Kay in 1972. They bought a large house. I mean, things were going really, really well for him. They had their first child in 1980. He would have 4 daughters between 1980 and 1985. But old Tom Capano, even though he kind of was like, one of these people that was giving a lot of money to the church, and his family all attended church together, and it was all of these things, and he's kind of this pillar of the community and stuff. He was a serial adulterer on his wife, and she never did know about it, at least from what we can tell. But this is, he was the kind of guy who got involved as into the state. First it was local and then state government, got to know a lot of people, but he just had this way of wanting to always, date outside of marriage, put it that way. So, so his career actually took off as well. So he had campaigned for Wilmington's mayor, Dan Frawley, in 1984, and then was hired as a city solicitor in Wilmington. Then Frawley hired him as his chief of staff. So now he's chief of staff to the mayor. And then in 1990, the governor, Mike Castle, offered him the position of chief counsel for the state. He was there for a couple of years. Tom Capano kind of jumped around a bit, but the thing is, even though he liked all the perks of the government and the position and all those things, he never seemed to really commit to anything. But then again, he didn't have to. He had a lot of money just from his family business that was given to him. So he never really worried about making a lot of money. So that wasn't a thing for him. He really enjoyed more of the attention and kind of the position. So he did consider running for state attorney general in the 1990s, but there was quite some problems in the family that would come to light more prominently if he had run for office. And so he didn't. One of the things was his brother Lou, who, like I said, was the kind of the second in charge after his father in the construction business, was basically making illegal campaign contributions. Lou is, I believe, the guy sitting on the couch with the beard. I think that's Lou. Or it's the guy standing. They look the same. They look pretty close to each other. But so Lou was caught giving illegal campaign contributions because he wanted some perks from these people that were running for office or in government, local government, because of zoning things that he needed, zoning laws that he wanted to try to get around with on some of his construction projects. So he was caught with that. Tom, already kind of high in state government and also an attorney, was able to get his brother out of that pretty much with a slap on the wrist. Later, there would be some issue. His brother Joey would. I think Joey's the one standing. Jerry is the one sitting with the red tie on the right, and Jerry's going to play very prominently in this case in just a minute here. But Joey, he actually got arrested because he was another one. He was another one who had a wandering eye. He also was married with 4 children, had a mistress for 9 years. And when she basically finally told him, it's over, he kidnapped her, held her captive, and sexually assaulted her. So again, Tom stepped in for him and was able to get him off of those charges, plead it down to sexual misconduct and criminal mischief or something, and basically just got probation. So it was a super crazy thing, but this is what was going on in this area, in this family at this time. So like I said, at that point, he got out of state government. He was kind of always in it though, because he became a partner in a law firm that was the bond counsel for the state of Delaware. So he was able to use his law degree, but also still all his political connections. Now this is where he comes in, and he meets Anne Marie Fahey. So this is when she started working in the governor's office as the scheduling secretary, and Tom Capano would meet her at a fundraiser. Go ahead and put this next slide up here. So this is the two of them next to each other. So he would meet Anne Marie in April of 1993. It was at a fundraiser for the Women's Democratic Club. I'm sorry. Okay, so I got his name a little bit wrong there. He was 43 when they met. She was 27. So like I said, he met her there, and then he started stopping by the governor's office, and he would always, say hello to her and chat with her. And we'll find out later, this is kind of his MO. Tom Carper. Don't do that, Esther. That's wrong. Tom Capano here's one of the things you have to know about him, and you'll see this he's very good at reading people and manipulating for his own purposes. And Anne Marie, because we know her background was very rocky, and she had a lot of things that were going on for her early on, where she felt abandoned, where she was abused verbally by her father, where she was made, felt like crap because either she was being verbally abused by her father, or she felt like a burden to other people. So she was kind of needy as far as getting somebody who could come along and basically say, I'm interested in you, find out about your life, and then start to try to be helpful. He started to give her advice and give her encouragement and all of these things. And this went on for quite a while, for several months. And then they started having lunch together because, he said, I want to talk to you more about what's going on in your life. And of course, that was something that she really was always hungry for. And I also think it was a little bit because he was older. It was almost like a big brother figure or a father figure to her. And this is something that had been lacking in her life, right? So he was one to definitely be able to zero in on all of the triggers for her and be able to say, I can feel that. So before you know it, he's kind of wormed his way into her life. It goes from lunches to dinners, and before you know it, they're having a sexual relationship. Now, this was something that she was always very conflicted about but by the time that they started seeing each other romantically, she felt like she was in love with this man. She really believed she was in love with him. He had made himself very indispensable to her. And so she became, very, what's the word? She became very dependent on him, almost emotionally, at least. Right. So, but then she also, like I said, her Catholic faith was very important to her. She realized this is not okay, and she just felt like it was just not a good thing anyway, and she just felt very guilty about it. So she was always very conflicted about this. And he would do a lot of different things, try to give her gifts. Some things she would take, a lot of things she didn't, because she always felt wrong, like taking things from him, from anybody really. And so this was going on for a while. But he was constantly trying to buy her affections, and of course, growing up poor, it's kind of a hook, right? So she would refuse most of these offers, like I said, but this continued to go on. Then, at some point it was about, I think between January she thought, okay, I'm in love with this guy. And then by that spring, so a few months later, she's like, okay, I have to end this. This is not okay. So in the spring of 1994, she ends the relationship with him. She blames herself for ending it. She said, I should have never started this. You're a good person. I did a terrible thing, and we just need to end this. 2 days after that, he calls her repeatedly. He's telling me he can't live without her. He's in love with her. He's going to leave his wife. He wants to kill himself. I mean, all of these things, right? And so she spends some weeks trying to break things off with him and getting reeled back in by his, these strong emotions that he's saying he has for her. He starts, almost to the point of being a stalker. And this will get to that point later on, but he calls her every day. He's constantly sending gifts. He's showing up, all of these. Now, meanwhile, she's never told anybody that she's seen this married man, especially not her family. So this hasn't happened. But here's the thing. During this time, this whole time that he's seeing her, she also doesn't know that he has been in another relationship outside of his marriage for almost 12 years with another woman, who he's telling the same things. He's saying, I'm in love with you. I want to leave my wife, but I can't because of my kids, and all of this stuff. So that's going on. This woman's name is Debbie McIntyre, and she'll come into play too when we get to the crime. So I told you earlier that she decided she was going to take a trip to Ireland with her brother. And this was the way she kind of broke things off, was she's going to be gone for, most of a month. She figures, okay, by the time, I'm gone for that much time, it'll be over. When I get back, it'll be over. And she had actually started dating somebody right before she left to Ireland. When she came back, like I said, about a month later, the guy that she had been dating, he just kind of, ghosted her. And so now she's feeling like crap again because she has this need, and she gets depressed when she feels rejected. Before you know it, Tom Capano is back in her life. He's calling her again, and they start kind of a quasi relationship at that point. So she still realizes this is a mistake, tries to break things off. But now he starts doing the more verbally abusive things to her, saying, I, ruined my marriage because of you, and you ruined my life, and those kind of things. So now she feels guilty. So now she has a harder time telling him, no, I don't want to see you. So he starts to do things like he's trying to shrink her world. And the way he does this is he says, look, that job at the governor's office, you need to get out of that. You're never going to make a lot of money there. I can get you a job working for my brother as his assistant. I'll give you, they'll give you a beautiful apartment, and which of course he'd be paying for. He'll give you a good salary, and I'll buy you a new car. On and on and on, those kind of things. At that point is when she was like, oh my God, I have to get out of this. This guy is out of control. Like, he's trying to control my whole life, right? So this is when she starts to realize that this is out of control. The longer I stay in this, the worse it's going to be. So finally it was around, so she's trying to keep him at arm's length, and he just keeps coming back. I don't know if anybody has ever been in a kind of relationship like that, when somebody's very, very persistent, but she didn't have a lot of good defenses for that, right? She didn't know how to just say, hey, get the hell away from me. I don't want to see you. I'm done. She would try to appease him and be nice and say, well, we could talk on the phone, but I can't see you. And of course, we know that doesn't work. You really have to cut it off. You really have to tell them in no uncertain terms that, no, this is my life and you're not in it. And she just couldn't do it, or couldn't bring herself to do it. She was, so in the fall of 95, she was introduced by her boss, the governor, to this guy who he thought would really like her, and she would really like him. Of course, nobody knew she was seeing, this married man. So he introduced him to a man named Mike Scanlon. And this is the perfect guy for her. They're just so alike. He's just comes from a big family like her. He is very committed Catholic. He's athletic. She's also very athletic. They socialize a lot with friends. I mean, she's just having a great time with this guy, and he's just, he's a serious boyfriend, and she can bring him to meet her family, which of course her family's so important to her, and she could not do that, of course, with Tom Capano. So this becomes that. Well, now he realizes that she's seeing somebody else, and Tom Capano does, and he starts getting very, very possessive at this point. She, by the end of that year, she's still trying to appease him, and she says, okay, we can just only talk by email only. And this is going on, another way to try to get him away from her. But what happens at this point now is that he starts, there's a couple of friends that she has told about him, just very close friends. One was her roommate. And he starts bringing her friends into it, the ones that know about him, saying, oh, I'm worried about Anne Marie, and, why don't we go take her to lunch, and we need to talk to her. And so, now she's embarrassed because he's bringing her friends into it. Meanwhile, with all this stress going on with Tom Capano, and now he's also threatening to spill beans to her boyfriend, Mike, that, she had an affair with a married man, which was him. Which is, pretty crappy. And so all of this stress has culminated in her eating disorder becoming much, much worse. So she's dropping weight like crazy. She looks very unhealthy. And he's using this as an excuse to reach out to her friends to try to bring her in to see him. And he's going to help her. And, we need to talk. And of course, she knows anytime she's in his presence, he's just going to keep pressuring her to continue seeing him. So she tries to avoid that. So by April of 1996, she creates a diary entry. Now, the thing about this is she has always journaled everything about her life. And this is going to be very important later on when she goes missing, to people to find out what was going on with her. So they have this diary, this journal that she leaves behind. And in this diary entry in 1996, she wrote, I have finally brought closure to Tom Capano. This is the only time that she wrote out his whole name. She would always use a code name or not put his name, just say he or him, because of course, he was a married man and she didn't want that in her people to find it, or I don't know, figure out who this was. But she wrote his name here. She said, I finally brought closure to Tom Capano. What a controlling, manipulative, insecure, jealous maniac. For one whole year, I allowed someone to take control of every decision of my life. So at this point, she's done, right? But she also writes this on that same entry. 5 weeks ago, I was diagnosed with bulimia. My current weight is 125 pounds. She says, I'm pretty skinny, but I want more. So she's still she would actually, and Anne Marie is 5'10". So she's very tall. 125 is underweight, and then she actually ends up getting down to about 117 pounds, which is, dangerously underweight. So she shuts the door, and this is how he brings her back. He tells her that his daughter, one of his young daughters, is having brain surgery, and of course she feels terrible. She calls, he emails her and tells her this, and she calls, oh my God, what's going on? I'm so sorry, how's she doing? That kind of thing. Well, she doesn't find this out for a few days, but that's a lie. That didn't happen. And he was just a way to, again, manipulate her. When she found out, then, she was done. But by then, like I said, he's badgering her friends. May 30th, he badgers her into having dinner with him. She, again, trying to appease him, okay, if I see him in person, he'll go away. So she sees him that one time. About 2 weeks later, she faints in her office because of, like I said, she's very unhealthy at this point. She faints. She doesn't want anybody to know how serious this eating disorder is. The only one who really knows how bad it's gotten is Tom Capano. So what does she do? She calls him to pick her up and drive her home because she doesn't want to tell anybody. She's embarrassed. And he knows all the worst about her because he's wheedled this out of her from the beginning of their relationship. So he knows. Okay, so now we're going to move on to, that's that crazy time of her life. So the last week that anybody saw Anne Marie Fahey, this is her home. She lives in, like I said, in Wilmington. I'm trying to remember what the address is here, but you'll see the building there. She lived in this is a house that was cut up into apartments, and she lived in one of the top floor apartments. So this is in June of 1996. This is Saturday. She goes shopping with her sister Kathleen. She tries on this pantsuit at this store called Talbot's, and it costs $300. Of course, it's way out of her budget. And her sister says, "You're crazy. You can't buy this." She goes, "I know. I'm not going to buy it." And that was the end of it. And that comes into play later. That's why I'm bringing it up. The next night, Sunday, she goes to her boyfriend Mike's house for dinner. On Wednesday, the 26th, she talks to a friend on the phone. She's in a good mood. She says she's gained a couple of pounds. She's very happy with her boyfriend, Mike. And that night she talks to Mike on the phone. And Saturday that weekend, they're supposed to go to her brother's house to have dinner with him and his family. And she told him that she would be off of work on Friday. She was taking just a personal day on Friday. Now on that Wednesday, Tom Capano emails her, and he says he has a gift for her and he wants to take her to dinner that night. And they would always go to this one restaurant. This is what he liked to take her when they were dating, to Panorama. It was in Philadelphia. She must have begged him off because they didn't go that night. But he emails her the next morning on Thursday, June 27th at 11:30. And it's clear from that email that they didn't meet that Wednesday night. They didn't have dinner, so she must have found some way to to beg him off. But what happens between her time getting at work and 4:30, like we said, we know that he emailed her at 11:30. That's all we know. And then like I said, on Saturday, she was supposed to go to dinner with her boyfriend at her brother's house. She doesn't show up. Mike doesn't hear from her. Sunday morning, they go to her apartment here, and she's gone. There's nothing. What they find is a box, a Talbot's box with that pantsuit that her sister knew that she didn't buy. So that's there with the pantsuit in it. There's some groceries that are sitting, that looks like they've been sitting out for a couple of days in her kitchen. That's all they know. So, but her sister, of course, is looking for clues of where she could be, finds in her desk some letters. And these letters are addressed to and from Tom Capano, who she's never heard of. So when the police come, her sister shows her, and obviously from these letters, this is somebody she's been dating, somebody who says he's in love with her, all of these things. So the police see the name. They know who Tom Capano is because he's well known in Wilmington, right? He's known to the police chief. He's known to the mayor. He's known to everybody. So they go to interview him that late that night, and he admits that he had been seeing her romantically before, but now they're just friends. He said he'd taken her to dinner on Thursday night in Philadelphia. He said he drove her to her apartment, dropped her off, and that was the last he saw her. And but they're very suspicious right away, and they start looking at some of other things in Anne Marie's house. And one of the things they find is her journal, and she says that he's controlling and manipulative and how she's trying to get away from him. They read all of this stuff and they say, okay, we need to find out more about this Tom Capano, right? Meanwhile, there's a huge search for her. This starts on the 4th of July weekend, which is that following weekend. There was rewards offered, all of that. The FBI was brought in because she went missing from Delaware, and the last place she was seen was Philadelphia. Of course, it's across the state line, so they were able to call the FBI and ask for their resources. A couple of strange things they find as they pull phone and credit card records from both Anne Marie and Tom Capano. His credit card records revealed that he'd spent $300 on a new rug, but when they went to go visit him, and look, he had just moved into a house. Now, he had left his wife at this point, and moved into another house, and everything was furnished brand new. And they're like, why did he just recently, like last week, buy a new rug? So so that was one of the things. And they also talked to his housekeeper, and she said, oh, that week, the week after Anne-Marie went missing, he told her not to come to the house. Then 3 weeks later, he had her come back, and she said some of the furniture was missing. Like the couch was gone, the rug was gone, there was a new rug, and there was 2 chairs and no couch. So they're like, something's going on. Something happened there, right? So they did they were able to, finally get a search warrant, and they went in and, combed it over, but that house was spotless, right? They found what appeared to be 2 spots of blood were found on the baseboard in the living room. They took it to the lab, turned out it was blood. Now what they have to do is match it to Anne-Marie, if possible. The other thing in the break they got about a week later was a project manager who worked for Tom Capano's brother, who worked for Lou Capano, said that on Monday, July 1st, this would be the Monday after Anne-Marie went missing, that his boss called him to empty some dumpsters at a construction site. He said, which was odd because we never empty. That was too early, like we don't do it that often. And we had just dumped it not long before, and they weren't full. So we don't dump them until they're full because it costs, money to do that. So they said, okay, so now they're going to go search the landfill, the Delaware landfill, right, in the area. And looked, didn't find anything. She's gone now for 8 weeks. They were able to she used to give blood pretty regularly, and they were able to get a blood sample, because this is DNA they can do, but it's not as it's not as precise, and there's not as much as they could do back in '96 as they can do now, of course. So they would have had to have her parents. They weren't doing like the sibling thing, that they didn't have that capability yet. So her parents were both dead, so they couldn't match them. But they were able to finally find this blood sample and match it, and it was a match to her. So they knew that her blood was in his house. But here's where the big break comes in. So his brother Jerry was the youngest one that I showed you earlier. It was discovered that he owned a home. Well, his brother owned a home in Stone Harbor, New Jersey, and Jerry had a boat there. So they were like, okay, obviously this guy must have killed her in his house, cleaned it up, and disposed of her body somehow, and they'd done this huge search, didn't find a body, finally decided, okay, well, she must be, he must have dumped her where? So this is where they're trying to figure out the landfill and all this. And they say, oh, boat, maybe dumped her, in the ocean. So they surveilled Jerry. This is a long-term investigation. They surveilled him for 11 months. Now, Jerry had problems in the past with drugs and alcohol, and I think he had some, drug convictions and things like that Tom had always gotten him out of. So now they decide to go do a raid on his house. Wasn't sure exactly what had come up for them. That something about firearms. There was something going on about firearms, and because he was a felon, if he had firearms in the house with drugs, that could become a parole violation, and he could go to jail. So sure enough, they go into his house, and they do a search, and they find not only cocaine, but they find guns in his toddler son's bedroom, which is, now they lean on him because they say that's, child endangerment. You can get your kids taken away, and we need you to tell us what you know. Because for some reason they had figured out that Jerry must know something. Well, they were right, because Jerry told them the following story. So I'll give you the whole thing. So earlier, a few months before, and this is where premeditation and first-degree murder comes in, because a few months before, his brother had come to him and asked him if he could get him a gun and some money. And his brother had told him that somebody was trying to extort him, and he might need to take care of him. He also said that at some point he may need to ask to use his boat. Now, this was a few months before Anne-Marie went missing. Meanwhile, his brother actually, Tom came back and gave him the gun, said he didn't need it. The cash, that's all he needed. So Jerry thought he must be able to pay these people off, and now everything's cool. So he was happy about that. But what happened is Tom was able to get his girlfriend, his mistress, Debbie McIntyre, to buy him a gun. And that's, of course, he didn't want the gun traced back to him. I guess maybe he thought, probably not a good idea how it traced back to my brother either. It's probably a little too close for comfort. And nobody knows about Debbie, so we'll just do that. But on Friday, June 29th, he did come and ask him for the boat. He arrived at Jerry's house early in the morning. And remember, this would be the morning after Anne Marie was last seen in Philadelphia, and where he said he had dinner with her. So as soon as he asked Jerry for the boat, Jerry said he asked him, "Did you do it?" And Tom said yes. Jerry says that at that point he doesn't want any part of it, but Tom says, "Hey, dude, I did all this stuff for you in the past, and you need to help me out now." And he finally, talks him into it. So he tells him to meet him at his house, at Tom's house. He says he needs to help him move a large, heavy cooler from the garage into his SUV. I'll show you this picture here. There's a cooler right here. So he said he needs to help him to move this cooler into the SUV. Jerry also sees in the garage a carpet rolled up. And so they pick up this cooler. He says it's very heavy, and they pick up this cooler and they put it into Tom's SUV. Tom says to grab the rug too, and Jerry tells him, "Well, what are you going to do?" He's like, "Well, we're going to go throw it, overboard." And he says the rug's not going to sink, just leave it. So they leave this rug behind. They drive out to Jerry's boat, get on the boat. Jerry says he drives it about 60 miles offshore, 60 miles. They grab the cooler that's closed up. I think they believe there was a chain around it, something that kept it closed, but it doesn't sink. Of course, it's a cooler. It's buoyant. It's not going to sink. It doesn't sink. So Jerry has a shotgun on the boat because sometimes he goes shark fishing, and sometimes you shoot at the sharks, I guess, after you pull them in, if they're not, whatever. It seems crazy to me to shoot a gun in a boat, but okay. I don't know anything about boating or guns, so I couldn't tell you. But he shots into the cooler to try to make it sink, but it doesn't work. Okay. So Tom says, "Okay, we're going to need to pull this back in. I'm going to take it." Now because he has never said there's a body in this cooler. Jerry just kind of assumes it's the body of his extortionist. That's what he says anyway. And Tom says, "Okay, we got to take the body out and dump it." And at that point, Jerry goes, "Dude, you're on your own. I don't want anything to know about a body. I'm not going to help you dispose of a body." He already has, but technically. So he says, "You're on your own." So Jerry walks to the front of the boat and says, "I don't turn around. I don't look." I can hear him. He gets the anchor, the chain and the anchors from the boat. Apparently he can hear him with the chains and the anchors because he said he's going to have to wrap it around the body to throw it into the ocean so it will sink. And he just says, "Well, tell me when you're done." So finally at some point, he hears something and he says, "Are you done?" And Tom says yes. And Jerry turns around just in time to see a foot and ankle slip into the ocean. So he saw definitely that it was a body. But he's not done with Jerry yet. He has Jerry come back to his house, to Tom's house, and go into the living room. And what Jerry sees on the couch is a large blood stain on the back of the couch, kind of like where you would be sitting, the back of the couch, he said about shoulder height. There was a big blood stain. And he didn't want it. He goes, "You have to help me, whatever." So they get the couch, and they put it into Tom's SUV, and they also put the rug in there, and that's what they dump into the dumpster on the construction site, which then Tom asks his brother to have emptied. So now there's two brothers implicated in this crime. So now with the story that they have, the blood with Anne Marie's blood, and they're able to get a arrest warrant for Tom Capano, and it was actually originally it was for obstruction of justice. They still had to build a case against him for first-degree murder. They were able to again find the murder weapon because they were able to find Debbie McIntyre and get the records and get her to talk, who finally did admit that he had asked her to buy the gun and give it to him. So this is where they were finally able to bring him to trial. See, like I said, he was arrested in November 1997, 1.5 years after Anne Marie was last seen. So this is Tom Capano here with all his files. This dress here was, I believe, one of Anne Marie's dresses. They wanted just to see if she would actually, if a 5'10" woman would actually fit in a cooler of that size, I believe was the reason they did that. Okay, let's see. So the trial begins, and so Tom Capano admits to disposing of her body, but he says it was Debbie McIntyre, his mistress, that was actually responsible for Anne Marie's death. He said Debbie McIntyre had shown up at his house while he was there with Anne Marie. They had gotten back together. They were, sitting there snuggling on the couch. Debbie comes in, is, furious because she finds out he's got another girlfriend. This is his story. And she pulls out a weapon that she's going to shoot herself in front of him. And he struggles with her with a gun. It goes off and shoots Anne Marie accidentally and kills her. Okay, so why then would you hide the body? He said so that, Debbie wouldn't get in trouble, which nobody believed. So on January 17, 1999, Tom Capano was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. It was the first time in Delaware history that a defendant was found guilty of a capital crime without a body. Anne Marie Fahey body has never been found, and that is, they dumped her in the ocean. There's going to be no body to be recovered. So he was actually in prison at the James T. Vaughn Correctional Center, and he had his. Let me see if I can find my note here. Coming at the end here, guys. If you have questions, he was, like I said, he was his conviction was upheld on appeal in 2008, but was remanded. He was remanded for resentencing because the death sentence that he got had not been handed down unanimously by the jury, which I guess became a thing in Delaware Constitution, that it had to be a unanimous verdict for the death penalty, and that hadn't happened in his case. So the state declined to seek the death penalty the second time. He was resentenced to life without parole, and Anne Marie's family filed a wrongful death suit against Capano and his brothers, who were, pretty dang wealthy at that time and should have had some responsibility, they thought, for helping to cover up her murder. Tom Capano died in prison in 2011 of a heart attack at the age of 61. So that was the story of Anne Marie Fahey. It's a pretty interesting case. There's a lot more to the story. To get through it pretty quickly. If you're all interested, there's this book, Anne Rule's book called "Never Let Her Go." This was a great resource. I read this years ago when it came out. And I remembered this case, so I was really glad to be able to cover it on the podcast. There was actually a TV movie made. What's his name? Mark Harmon played Tom Capano. It was actually a pretty good TV movie. You can probably find it on YouTube or somewhere. But that was, it was a pretty well done. It really followed the case pretty closely. The movie did, so it's worth watching. So what time are we at here? We're just a couple of minutes till we end, I think, but I'll let you guys let me know what you want to do next.
Hello. Thank you for sharing that story. It was really interesting to learn about something that happened locally here. We have a couple of questions for you. Okay. Just I don't know how you want to break them up.
Okay.
So let's see. What made you decide to start a true crime podcast?
I've always followed true crime. I started reading true crime books when I was in high school. The first one was an Anne Rule book. It was the one about Ted Bundy called The Stranger Beside Me. And once I read that book, I was like hooked. I wanted to learn all about, these cases, and especially because she went into the backgrounds of the killers and the victims. And I became very interested in that. I actually ended up going to school and going to college and getting a master's degree in correctional psychology. Um, but I really didn't want to work in the prisons. I like counseling. I like working with people that are on the outside, inside. I've done it, but it's difficult. There's only so much you can do when people are incarcerated. It's difficult, and there's only so much funding for it as well. So I was doing that, and then I just started my counseling career as a counselor, and then I always wanted to do a podcast. I love podcasts. I think I was a big fan of podcasts from when they first started, and I thought if I ever could just talk about something I was really interested in on a podcast, it would be true crime. But I thought, is people going to listen to that? Because it's kind of dark and and weird. But I started planning one anyway because I taught myself the podcast about 2011, I think. And then I was always thinking about doing a podcast. Started to get serious about it around 2014. And that's when the podcast Serial came out. And if you guys know anything about that podcast, it became like this huge phenomenon. It was the Adnan Syed case, which was investigated as a wrongful conviction of a murder of a couple in high school. And I thought, well, two things. Obviously, there's a audience for this because that was a true crime, case. It was a 10 episode podcast about that one case. I thought, well, there's millions of people listen to that. And I thought, at least, I know there's an audience for this. And number two is Serial ended. So there's going to be people that are going to be looking for more of that kind of content. So now's a good time to launch. So I launched it in June of 2016. And within a week, I had over 4,500 downloads, which I didn't know at the time, but it was really good because that doesn't happen. By the second week, I had one person that I met who was a true crime podcaster, and they were a pretty big show called the Generation Y podcast. And I met Justin, became friends with him. He mentioned my podcast that I just launched a couple of weeks earlier on his show, and that next week I had 75,000 listeners. So it just took off from there. So I ended up doing it as a weekly podcast. I realized I had an audience. So within about a year, I realized I have enough of an audience where I can get sponsors. So I was probably about a year podcasting when it became my full-time job. So that doesn't normally happen. I was just in the right place at the right time, and I can always talk about true crime cases. The thing I didn't know is that I would be writing like a term paper every single week because I do it as a scripted. The way that I did it today for you guys was more of a conversational, but usually I have it written out like a script because I want to just tell the story straight. And so it's a little bit different. So I do have to write out every word. When I finished college, I thought, oh God, thank God, no more books, no more papers, and then now, a few years later, it's like I'm writing every single week, but it's something that I love. So it's not that hard. It's just a lot of time. It's just a lot of time sitting and typing.
Okay, the next question is, what's been your favorite case that you've covered so far?
Oh gosh, that's a hard one. Yeah, it's really hard because there's so many. I did a series because, like I said, every month I do a different topic, and I did one called "The Day the Music Died." And I love music. I love all kinds of music, and so I was able to find cases that I've done it a couple of times actually. I've been able to fit some things in there to actually research and tell the story of something that affected, a musician, a crime. So a crime or a mysterious death. So I've done Marvin Gaye, who was murdered by his father. I've done Selena, who we know was murdered by her fan club president. I've done Kurt Cobain because people have there's still a debate. Was it murder or suicide? So we took that on. I did Bob Marley because there was an assassination attempt on him. So those are really fun to do. And I also like every year, maybe around October, I'll do something that has like a haunted or paranormal connection to it. I've done haunted homicides. There's a serial killer in gosh, I swear when I have to remember names I forget. But I remember the name of the house. It's called Fox Hollow Farm. it was a serial killer that brought his victims back to this house. He had a big house. Inside had a basement kind of pool room. And people to this day say that house and that pool room are haunted because that's where he killed his victims. So that was super creepy to research and then talk about. And people to this day said it's really weird because if you listen on that episode, people said you can hear things in the back, and they thought I had added like weird sounds and stuff, and I didn't. And then I went and I listened to it, and there was some weird thing. I don't know. You can hear a voice of a child and there was no kids around when I recorded. So it's super creepy. I don't know why that happened, but it made people more interested to listen to it. And it was fun to do. I did do some special effects in that one, but that wasn't one of them. So people don't believe me to this day, but I did not. So those haunted ones are really fun too.
All right, and our last question is, how do you decide which cases to cover?
That's, I think one of the best decisions I made when I started the podcast was to decide that every month I was going to think in titles. Okay, so like when I thought of the podcast, I thought, okay, it's going to be telling true crime stories. So that's why I called it Once Upon a Crime, because it brings the crime in, but it also brings the storytelling kind of thing. I think in titles. So I always think of a title and then, okay, what would fit? Like I'll think usually of one case. Like this Anne Marie Fahey case, I thought, okay, that's interesting because the body wasn't found, but yet the person was convicted. And so I thought, okay, well, we're going to call it body of evidence. And I'm going to try to find other cases that are like that, the body wasn't found, person was convicted. So that's the way I figure that out, because I usually will start with one case that I know I want to cover, like the Anne Marie Fahey, and then find other ones that fit into that theme. So then I can research and look for no body murder convictions, and then I'll find the ones that I think are most interesting. But there has to be a couple of things in order for me to choose it. One, it has to be already resolved. For the most part, I don't really do like unresolved, missing people, still, don't know who the murderer is. I want an ending because I like to read and I want the end of a book. I don't want the last page ripped out and I don't know what happened. So it has to have an ending. I have to know everything till the end. And also there could be, something that I can kind of sink my teeth into, whether it's the psychology of the killer or some strange twist, or you didn't see that coming, or so I'm always digging for details about stuff that even stuff people think they know about, but maybe they didn't have these details. So that's kind of my thing. I don't want to just hear something I've already heard before and not learn anything new. So I really try to dig for something that I think is, whoa, I didn't know that had happened, or that's a strange connection to this thing. So it helps me to figure out 4 or 5 or 6, episodes that I'm going to do in the next, month or two. So that helps, because otherwise, I want to do some that people know, but I also want to do some that maybe people have never heard of. That to me are pretty interesting, that maybe I think people would get intrigued by the story that they didn't know about.
All right. Thank you so much, Esther, for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thanks so
we all had a great time.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right, everyone. So that's it. Check out the UD programming board on Student Central for the rest of our Spooky Week events that are taking place throughout the rest of the week. Tomorrow we have a tarot card reading, so you can sign up using the link on Student Central. And on Friday, we're having an in-person movie event with free U-Dairy, so be sure to stop by for Screams and Ice Cream. Have a good night, everyone, and thanks for listening.